Stephen Byer's Grammar of Tibetan, Written Tibetan, in the intro to that, or preface to that, he says if you want to get into Tibeto-Burman linguistics, you should read Variational Semantics in Tibeto-Burman twice. It's the most fun book you'll ever read, and so that'll get you hooked.
That was nice of him, yeah. The motivation for that book was Laurent Morin, the Jingpo guy that I mentioned before, asked me to do a book on, was it Tibeto-Burman body parts, or basic Tibeto-Burman core vocabulary, something like that. And so the first semantic point I wanted to work with was stomach, belly. So I started working on that, and then I saw, oh, there are words here which mean, which are obviously cognate, which mean like cave or hollow object, or some seem to mean liver, but it's look the same phonological shape as stomach, and so. So again, I got lost in the woods and got into this topic of variation, and tried to develop a kind of framework for talking about this, introduce various terms like allopham for a member of a word family, allophamic alternations and things like that. And those diagrams showing the different points in semantic space, which again, justified by either the same language shows ambiguity between, or vagueness between different points in semantic space, or one language has the etymon, which means one thing, and a cognate related language has the same etymon, which means something else. So that gives you the right to make a line between the 2 points in semantic space.
And that, of course, was part of the step as well.
Right.
That morphed into, to some extent, the step.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right.
I thought there was some kind of initial point where there was the etymology for liver and connecting it with the Chinese word for bitter, and somebody criticized that, and you decided to show that it was valid. Do I have that wrong?
I don't remember that, but it could well be. Yeah. And of course, well, the people like Zhang Kun, who was my nominal dissertation advisor, he objected to some of my semantic identifications. Where in one language it meant dry, and the other language meant to dry up. He thought this was too far. There are people who can't stand the idea of variation. Saga is like that. What I call protoform stuffing, where if you can't find conditioning factors for certain developments, what you can do is put everything into the protoform, and then deduce everything from that. And Benedict sort of did that with his Ostrotai, with his trisyllabic roots. And some of the reflexes would reflect the first 2 syllables, some the second and third syllable, that kind of thing. So he even had the concept of split cognates. Taxi cab, yeah. Or Liza and Beth from Elizabeth. But there aren't too many well-attested examples of that kind of thing. So, yeah, the concept of variation is always fascinating me, because if you look at any living language, it's rife with variation on all levels of language. And to think that we could be arrogant enough to think that we could reconstruct kind of flawless patterns of semantic interchange, to go back thousands of years, kind of a priori, it doesn't work. So, as I mentioned before, one of the projects I'd like to get to is a general book on semantics, written in a kind of semi-popular way, I think, not too stuffily academic, but also not superficial, I hope. So, the Yiddish book sort of fell between the stools there, between academic and popular. So something like these vulgar books like Leo Rostin's The Joy of Yiddish, which just talks about, Yiddish words that everybody knows, like schmuck and things like that, and just does riffs on them. That's what I would call popularization. It amuse people, but not much content.
Mm-hmm.
And then one can write about the most interesting stuff in a very boring, stuffy way too. So I would like to avoid those two extremes.
Well, you usually have.
I was going to do this book on mainland Southeast Asian languages for Cambridge University Press, but I got lost in the woods there, trying to go into too much detail with every topic, and so I've let that slide. But I do want to write a semantics book when I finish the Lahu texts, which are going to come out soon. Yeah, or linguistic curiosities I've been collecting over the years, ambiguities and speech errors and this and that.
Good.
Getting back to Southeast Asia, is something I call psychocollocations. In many of the languages of the region, mental states and cognitive processes and emotions are expressed in a kind of overt way, phenotypic in Worf's terms rather than cryptotypic, in that you mention a particular body part which is considered to be the seat of the emotions or the thoughts, either the mind or the liver or the heart or the gallbladder, or those are the most common ones, and then an adjective or an action verb which goes with it, which characterizes the particular mental thing going on. So many languages have liver is small means you're a coward, or liver is big, they can sometimes have a good meaning, sometimes a bad meaning. It can either mean be brave or be foolhardy. And this is not confined to Southeast Asian languages, but pretty much all over the world you can find it, although it's very obvious in Southeast Asian languages. So this has kind of caught on, and people have written other things about psychocollocations. Ken Van Beek has done it for Chin languages and many other people.
Anijese and Eric.
Eric Wee for Austronesian, Anijese for Hmong. Yeah. Somebody did for Vietnamese too, I think. Okay, one of the syntactic phenomena which interested me a lot in Lahu was the fact that you could string verbs together, not without limit and not without conditions, but 2, 3, or even 4 or 5 together to make complex verb phrases. And the generative grammar of the time would claim that each one of these verbs belonged to a different underlying sentence. And so you had to do all kinds of cranking of generative machinery in order to delete certain things which wouldn't appear on the surface and so forth. But take a much simpler approach and just deal with it as simple juxtaposition being a syntactic process. By the way, I had first gotten into this with respect to Jingpo. In fact, my first article really was called Verb Concatenation in Kachin, which got into the first issue of LTBA. I put it into the first issue of LTBA. On the basis of my work with Leroy Moran, I found these complex Jingpo verb phrases where you could have 2 or 3 verbs in a row with nothing in between. And then I came up with the idea that there was a continuum of abstractness, and the more distant a verb was from the first verb in the chain, the more abstract it would be. And the closer it is to the beginning of it, the more concrete it would be. So
it's not just scope, but actually abstractness.
Abstractness.
I don't think anybody's talked about that.
That the more abstract something is, the greater the chance that its semantic features are not going to come in conflict with those of other verbs. But if something has too concrete a meaning, like to sneeze, for example, you're not going to find sneeze as a versatile verb, a grammaticalized verb. Although you could probably make up a story in which sneeze meant to do something trivial, to sneeze at, but that's not an attested semantic development. Not as nowhere near like a word meaning to live or dwell, being recruited to be a marker of progressive aspect, or a verb meaning to finish being a marker of perfected, and these things which you find in language after language. But the interesting thing about Loloish is that you can get 3, 4, or 5 occasionally. Sometimes I was guilty of constructing weird sentences just to get more verbs in a row, but a lot of them just occurred in natural speech. And it looks deceptively simple, this juxtaposition, but there's actually a complex semantic pattern that they show, as well as syntactic. So,
you mentioned LTBA. Could you talk a little bit about the development of that, where the idea came from, and how it developed?
Sure. This was back in the 60s, the 70s. I had 2 students then called Jim Bowman and Mark Okrand. And Graham Thurgood, yes. Graham Thurgood, yes. That was the time that Roy Andrew Miller wrote his scathing review of Benedict's Conspectus. In the 3, he called it Inspection of a Conspectus. So I wrote a reply to it called Rejection of a Conspectus Inspection. And in it, he attacked Benedict for all kinds of irrelevant things. Anyway, I wanted to reply to this, and I said, and this time Graham, I think it was, who had the idea, maybe we should start a journal, and we could put this article in the first issue. And we did that. There was hesitation at first on the part of Jim Bowman. He thought, why start a new journal in the midst of controversy like this? Why not just be straightforward at first? But we argued, and they eventually agreed it would be an okay thing to do. And in those days, Graham actually printed the first few issues on a printing press in the basement of a church in Berkeley, where his wife was a wedding organizer or something, and so he had access to the Xerox machine, and stapled all the copies individually and stuff, and only a very small press run. It gradually got gentrified through the years, and now when it's about, I don't know, volume 30 or 35 or...
Yeah, close to that. I don't know exactly, 36 minutes.
Yeah, it's been taken over by Brill and comes out in Benjamin's, kind of with a handsome multicolored cover, and it costs a lot more money than it used to. And as soon as computers came in, all kinds of people wanted to computerize all the back issues, and so that's been done. But there was very little. I was editor for quite a few years, and I used to accept everything. It's just like that. Even very badly written things by Chinese or Japanese scholars, I would virtually rewrite from scratch, just because I thought it was important to get these things out.
We also published translations of some Chinese articles and things, but I think no more probably. I don't know. I haven't seen any in a while.
Yeah. So now it's well established and peer-reviewed. I think each manuscript has to go out to 2 or 3 reviewers. All this stuff is new. Job talks and peer reviews and all this. This is all. This is all new.
The peer review is my fault. Sorry about that. But anyway, I tried to keep it private and cheap. But anyway, it's kind of difficult to maintain. It was very expensive to maintain, whereas they took it over and they actually give us money. I mean, I'm not the editor anymore, but they give money to the editor rather than the editor having to find money.
How does the line of editorship go? After me, there was Graham,
and
then you, and then Alec.
And now it's back to Graham.
It's back to Graham.
Yeah, Alec doesn't have time to deal with it now, and so it's back to Graham, and David is associate editor, I think, something like that.
Okay, another topic I've been interested in for a long time is the Yiddish language. My father is a native speaker of Yiddish. He was 13 years old when he left Belarus for the United States back in 1923. And when I was growing up, I was exposed to Yiddish quite intensively because there were daily conversations with my grandmother over the phone, half in Yiddish, half in English. And my father was almost incapable of carrying on an extended conversation without throwing in Yiddish. It was kind of code switching all the time. And my parents tried to use it as a secret language, which of course didn't work because that just encouraged me to learn. As I got older, I studied German. That was a big interference with Yiddish. But when I got to Columbia, which was a great center of Yiddish studies under the great Uwe Weinreich, who died at age 39, tragically, of awful kind of cancer, it became a world center for Yiddish studies. Weinreich was also a semanticist and did pioneer work in that field. He wrote a book when he was like 18 or 19 called College Yiddish, which I read when I was at Columbia. And for the first time, that was a systematic treatment of Yiddish grammar, which I devoured. I actually ended up teaching Yiddish a couple of summers at Columbia. I would play folk songs on the guitar, my 5 chords that I knew. And that was fun. But I've gotten more and more into it, actually. I wrote in when it came out, 79, I think it was, 79, this book called Blessings, Curses, Hopes, and Fears, Psycho-Ostensive Expressions in Yiddish. I'm incapable of writing a title that doesn't have a colon in the middle. First the snappy title and then the descriptive title. I noticed this phenomenon of throwing parenthetical phrases into Yiddish utterances, which express the speaker's psychological attitude. So I call them psycho-ostensive. So they can either be blessings or thanks, like, thank God I feel pretty good for being 80 years old, something like that. Or what they call apotropaic, or avoiding evil, like he has shingles, it shouldn't happen to you, that sort of thing. Or, let's see, malapetitive cursing would be, well, I have these parameters. We have recognitive, which is just recognizing that there's a certain state. Then there's petitive, which means wishing a certain thing would happen. And then fugitive, which is fleeing for a certain thing. And then there's yourself, auto, and others, allo. And then there's bono and malo. So if you can combine these, self and other, and bono and malo, and then recognitive, fugitive, and petitive, you get all the things that you have. So, yeah, my son, may he live and be well, graduated from college this year. That's allo bono petitive, because it's wishing good to somebody else. Or, thank God I'm feeling pretty good, that's auto bono recognitive, and so forth. So this sort of put a framework around it. And, it never got properly reviewed in an academic publication. I sent it to Del Himes once for publication, an anthropology thing, and he said, just a list.
It's more than that, it's a fun book.
Yeah.
That's also why they wouldn't publish.
Anyway, it received a few reviews in the Yiddish press, but that's it. I had a student much later called Jordan Finken who wrote a review of it, a very nice review, but no one accepted it because it was too long after the original publication. It was republished after 79. It came out again in 2000 and something. It came out in Hebrew before it came out in English, actually. This guy who was visiting scholar at Berkeley, Benjamin Hrushevsky, who later Hebraized his name to Harshav, I gave him a copy of it, and he was editor of a journal called Hasifrut in Jerusalem, literature, and he published it there. Hannah Kronfeld, who is now in the Berkeley German department, translated into Hebrew, and he published it. I still speak Hebrew. And I've been to Jezreel twice in the last 3 years, and I have tons of cousins and other relatives there.
In Israel?
In Israel, yeah.
Oh.
Who vary politically from extreme liberal to extreme right wing. Like one of my cousins lives in Hebron, this is a little Jewish enclave surrounded by an Arab city where they have to have a huge military presence to protect them. And then others couldn't care less about religion and stuff, and just totally secular. And it's a fascinating place. I love being there. And since Yiddish has a very strong Hebrew component, a lot of the literary vocabulary and technical vocabulary is of Hebrew origin. So that makes it interesting. Plus, I've been taking a Yiddish literature class for the last 4 or 5 years now. We read novels in Yiddish.
At the university or where?
Yeah, it was a Jewish community center. It was vaguely connected to the university. And we're each responsible for a page or two each time. We have to read it out loud and talk about the difficult words. That's a lot of fun. So I actually retired in 2001. Two. As soon as I turned 65. I had thought I was going to, teach forever, as long as I could stand up in front of the class. But by the time I turned 65, I thought, maybe I should do other things. So I've been doing what I always used to do ever since, except teaching classes. And this year, number 50, sort of brings it all full circle. And I'm not ready to call it quits yet. I still have a lot of projects I want to do. Anyway, it's been a nice ride, and not over yet, as far as I can see. So.
Thank you very much, Professor Matisoff, for a very enlightening interview. We'll call it a day now, and I wish you all the best in the future.